Hi everyone, it's Megan here from Meghanmakesdo, and today I'm going to show you how to attach two knit squares together using a crochet hook and the slip stitch technique. For today's tutorial, I'm using Line Brand Basic Stitch Anti-Pilling in the color black, and I'm going to be attaching these two squares using a 4.5mm crochet hook. I'm using a hook that's smaller than the needle I use to make my knit squares, and you can use whatever hook gets you the right tension that you desire for your seams. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm just going to take my black yarn, and for this tutorial I'm using the squares that I used in my Gemma blanket, and we're just going to lay them down. So I'm laying mine down with one side like the raw edge facing, and the other edge is going to be the cast on or bind off edge of the square. So that's how my blanket is put together, so that's how I'm going to show you for this tutorial. But if you're making other knit squares for another project, you can always line up those cast on and bind off edges. It's totally up to you, but for this tutorial I'm going to use what I have on hand, which is my Gemma squares. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and be attaching the squares together, but just note that for these squares I have less stitches than I do rows, so I'm going to have to skip a few rows on this square here on the left so that I'm getting it perfectly aligned. This is a pretty basic technique. It doesn't take a whole lot of crochet skills, so if you haven't ever crocheted before, don't worry, I think that you'll be able to handle this as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay my working yarn down in between my two squares, because I'm always going to be pulling it from underneath, and this just helps keep it underneath my work. I'm going to leave a small little tail over here on the end for weaving in when I'm all done. And I'm going to take my crochet hook and I'm going to insert it from the top of my square to the bottom. You're always going to go from top to bottom when you're inserting your hook. And I'm just going to go through one loop on the very bottom outside edge of my square. And then I'm going to go over to the left square. And again, from top to bottom, I'm going to, or front to back, I guess you could say, I'm going to go from and insert my hook into one loop on that side, like along the edge of the row. And then I'm going to yarn over and draw my yarn up through both those loops. Okay, so now I'm just going to repeat that process going all the way up the two squares. And again, you're always working from the right side of your work to the back side, the wrong side of your work. So from front to back, going through just one loop along that bind off or cast on edge of the square on the right, and then going over to the left and again going from front to back through one loop, and then I'm going to yarn over, draw that yarn through all the loops on my hook. So you're going to be going through 3 loops total, and that causes a little slip stitch. So you'll start to see our seam forming, and it's a visible seam. That's what I'm using here. Now, if you were making solid squares and you wanted to just use the same color as your solid squares, it would be pretty much invisible, but we want our seam to show. That's why I'm using a contrasting color. So again, you go through from front to back through one loop on the right side, front to back through one loop on the left side, and then draw your yarn through all the loops on your hook. And you're just going to keep repeating that process, and you'll see that we have this nice, it almost looks like a chain stitch, but it's slip stitches, so it's like surface slip stitch if you're doing crochet. And this just nicely seams our knit squares together. It makes a very flat seam and a visible seam, which is what we want for this project. So it does take a little bit of time. Sometimes it can be hard to get your hook in those little loops. For the square on the left, right now that we're working into the rows, since we have more rows than stitches, we're going to skip a few of those rows. It won't really make a difference, but I do recommend kind of lining up your squares as you go to make sure that you have your tension correct, and that you're not ending up with an excess of stitches on the one end. But yes, just continue to insert your hook from top to bottom, going through one loop on either side, and pulling your yarn through all loops on your hook. And you'll just continue to do this all the way up these first 2 squares. Okay, so we've gotten to the end of these 2 squares. You can see my nice flat seam. It kind of blends in and goes with the theme of this blanket. And then if you're making the Gemma blanket, I'll link to it below. You would just continue to add squares without fastening off. So I'm going to go ahead and grab 2 more squares. This time my cast off or bind off edge will be on the left hand side, and my raw edge or side edge or row edge will be on the right. But again, we're going to use the same technique to attach these 2 squares together, and I'm just going to simply keep going with this straight seam, so that way at the end I only have 2 ends to weave in for this whole column. So again, I'm going to make sure that my yarn is in between my 2 squares so it's a little bit easier to pull it up from beneath my work. And then kind of pulling my yarn tight, I'm going to go from right side to wrong side through 1 loop on the right, and from right side to wrong side or top to bottom through 1 loop on the left, and then draw my loops through. Sometimes this first loop on the right can be a little bit tricky, so I have to kind of help guide it through and then through the last loop. And then I kind of just pull it tight, make sure that it's secure, and continue going. So again, insert your hook through 1 loop on the right square and 1 loop on the left square, and then draw your working yarn through all loops on your hook. And we're going to repeat this process all the way up these 2 squares. Okay, so I'll zoom in here to get you a little closer look at this process and to see what I'm doing. So always insert your hook from the top to the bottom, and make sure you're drawing through all hooks or all loops on your hook. So you'll see I'm just going to continue to finish this seam. I'm going to keep attaching 2 squares at a time until that whole column is finished. And then I'm going to go ahead and show you how to then go back and do the rows so that you're attaching all your squares along this line here. So I'll be right back and I will show you how it's done. Okay, so I've finished all the columns on my blanket. I've gone all the way up, and now I want to attach the next column, so the next set of squares. So I'm going to go all the way back down to the bottom where I started and just grab 1 more square, and I'm going to be attaching now 1 square at a time instead of 2 at a time. So again, same technique as before. We're just going to go ahead and grab our working yarn, and we're going to go ahead and attach them exactly the same way that we used to. So once you have all of your columns done, so all of your squares attached, it'll look something like this. So then once that's complete, we can go back and we can start attaching the rows going across our piece to complete the blanket. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how that's done. Same technique as before. So here I have all of my columns are done, but I have these openings here in between my squares. So same as before, I'm going to grab my working yarn, so my black yarn. I'm going to line up my squares so that I make sure that they're being evenly attached. And I'm going to lay my working yarn underneath my blanket. So this part can get a little bit tricky because we want to always be pulling our yarn from underneath our work. And that can get tricky since we already have some joins already in the corners of our squares. So leave a little bit of a tail. And again, working with our crochet hook, we're going to be inserting our hook along the edge of each of our squares. And for the squares that you're working into the row, like this one on the right, I try to pick one stitch that goes all the way along. So pick a row and go all the way along that edge. But again, always working from the right side of your piece to the wrong side of your piece. Insert your hook through one loop on the right square, and then insert it from front to back through one loop on the left square, and then yarn over and draw your yarn up and through all loops on your hook. And just repeat that process all the way up until we get to this first joined corner that we already have. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of a closer up view of what I'm doing here. I sped it up just a tiny bit so that we can get through it, but you can see that I'm inserting my hook from top to bottom, or wrong side, right side to wrong side, through one loop on each square, and then yarning over and drawing that yarn through all loops on my hook. And again, I just skipped one of the rows on the right square since I do have a couple extra rows versus stitches in my squares. So wherever you want to place those skips, it's totally up to you. I tend to do one skip in every white section, and then I skip every black row. But continue to do this all the way up your square until we get to that corner, and then I'll show you how to kind of jump over that corner to continue working. Okay, so we're almost to that first corner, the join where we already have worked a seam. So this part can get a little bit tricky. It's a little bit more difficult to grab that yarn because remember, you're always going to be pulling it from underneath the blanket. So just take your time, go slow if you need to. You don't have to rush this process because you want your seams to be nice and neat. So we're almost to the corner here. Like I said, those last couple stitches can be a little bit tricky to maneuver, so just take your time. So here I'm going to be working my last stitch to join my first two squares on this row. And again, that last stitch can be a little bit tricky to get into. So if you need to go down a hook size so that your hook can easily fit into the stitches, that's fine too. So here I've hit my first corner, and I'm just going to go right on top of that seam. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the next two squares. Again, inserting my hook from top to bottom in both sides, and then drawing those yarn through all loops on my hook. So you can see I've just kind of hopped right over that seam, just kind of pretending that it's not even there. But you'll get a nice crisp seam here, and then you can continue working along this row, joining all of those squares that have not been joined yet. I guess all those square sides that haven't been joined. And we're just going to go right along this whole row until we've attached all the squares. And then we'll move on to the next one until all rows have been attached. So I'm going to go ahead and continue working this row, picking up always my yarn from underneath, inserting my hook on the right square from top to bottom through one loop, to the left square from top to bottom through one loop, and then drawing my working yarn through all loops on my hook. And that's how you'll work your slip stitch seam. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope that you also will give it a try. If you're looking for the Gemma Blanket knit pattern, I'll put a link to that pattern in the description below. It is a free pattern on my blog. And you can also find a printable PDF version in my shop, as well as a complete kit with all the yarn and tools that you'll need from lionbrand.com. All links are in the description. Don't forget to like this video, and I hope that you subscribe.